The room fell quiet the moment she stepped forward, and somewhere behind the judge's table, a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of not being impressed felt something crack open in his chest. Nobody expected it. Not the audience shifting in their seats, exchanging glances and quiet whispers. Not the cameras panning across rows of skeptical faces, waiting for something to laugh at. And certainly not Simon Cowell, a man whose entire public identity had been built brick by brick on detachment, on the kind of clinical, unsentimental judgment that made careers and ended them in the same breath, often in the same sentence. He did not do sentiment. He did not do tears. His face was, for most of television history, a wall. And yet, years after a middle-aged woman in a simple dress walked onto a stage in front of the world, he would sit across from an interviewer and find himself undone. Not performing emotion for the cameras, not delivering a rehearsed soundbite, but genuinely, visibly overcome by the memory of her. His voice caught. He looked away. For a few seconds, the most famously unbothered man in entertainment simply couldn't speak. What could do that to someone like Simon Cowell? The answer doesn't start on that stage. It starts long before the lights and the cameras in a small town most of the world had never heard of, with a woman most of the world would never have noticed, until suddenly everyone did. Susan Boyle grew up in Blackburn, West Lothian, a working-class town in Scotland where ambition was measured in modest, practical terms, and music was treated as a private joy rather than a public pursuit. She was one of several children in a family that didn't have much room for grand dreams. And from an early age, she carried something that set her apart from her siblings and classmates, a diagnosis of learning difficulties that shaped how teachers spoke to her, how classmates treated her, and, eventually, how she came to see herself. She was the outsider, the quiet one, the girl other kids didn't quite know what to do with. School was hard, socially and academically, and the misunderstandings that followed her through childhood didn't disappear with age. They simply changed shape, becoming the quiet judgments of adults instead of the casual cruelty of children. Through all of it, she found one place where none of that seemed to matter: music. She sang in church. She sang in local halls and community events, never on any stage that counted for much, never in front of anyone who might change her life. It wasn't a career. It was survival, a private space where she didn't have to explain herself to anyone. As she grew older, her world narrowed further, not by choice but by necessity. Both of her parents fell ill, and Susan took on the role of caretaker, first for one and then the other, in a stretch of years that swallowed most of her 20s, 30s, and 40s. Her own ambitions, the ones she rarely spoke about out loud, were quietly pushed aside, again and again, in favor of obligations that never seemed to end. By the time both her parents had passed away, Susan Boyle was a woman in her late 40s, living a life that had never once intersected with fame, with an unspoken dream she had never truly let herself chase. And then, in 2009, at an age when most people are told their moment has already come and gone, she walked onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent. The reaction in that auditorium before she'd even sung a single note tells you almost everything you need to know about how the world was prepared to see her. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone in the audience rolled their eyes. A camera caught the flicker of a smirk on a judge's face. Not cruel exactly, just resigned, the look of people who believed they already knew how this was going to go. She was 50 years old, unglamorous, unpolished. She wore a plain dress and glasses, and she carried herself with the kind of nervous, unguarded honesty that television rarely rewards. The room had already written her off before she had taken a single breath. Then she opened her mouth, and the first line of "I dreamed a dream" left her lips. It is hard to fully describe what happened in that auditorium in the seconds that followed, because words tend to flatten what was, by every account, a seismic shift in the air itself. The smirks vanished. The whispers stopped mid-sentence. Bodies that had been slumped in casual judgment sat suddenly, sharply upright. And somewhere in that shift, a television audience of millions, watching from their living rooms on the other side of the world, felt the exact same jolt. That uncomfortable, thrilling realization that they had been seconds away from laughing at someone who was about to silence them completely. Susan Boyle's voice did something that talent alone rarely manages to do. It forced an entire room, and eventually an entire planet, to confront its own prejudice in real time. The audience wasn't just moved by her singing, striking as it was. They were confronted, almost against their will, with how quickly and how casually they had dismissed her only moments earlier, how little it had taken for them to decide she didn't matter. Simon Cowell watched all of this unfold from behind the judge's table, and by his own later admission, he was not prepared for it. The blunt, unshakable critic, a man who had sat through thousands of auditions and turned away contestant after contestant without so much as a flicker of hesitation, sat there stunned, caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to awe. It wasn't only that she could sing, though she clearly could, in a way that few of the professionals who'd auditioned before her ever managed. It was the collision between what everyone in that room had assumed about her and what she actually was, a collision so sudden and so total that it seemed to rewire, in the space of 2 minutes, how an entire industry thought about talent, appearance, and who deserves the benefit of the doubt before they've even opened their mouth. The footage of her audition spread across the world within days, then hours, racking up view counts that no one on that production had anticipated, becoming one of the defining viral moments of the early internet age. Susan Boyle wasn't just a contestant anymore. She had become something closer to a symbol, living proof delivered in the most public and unfiltered way imaginable, that genuine talent does not announce itself by looking the part first. But virality is a strange, unforgiving kind of fame, and it does not come free. It rarely asks whether the person at the center of it is ready. What followed Susan's audition was not the tidy fairy tale ending the world wanted so badly to believe in. Fame arrived overnight, and it arrived without an instruction manual. A woman who had spent 50 years living quietly, caring for aging parents, singing in church halls where no one was filming, moving through life largely unnoticed, was suddenly thrust into the center of a global media storm, with cameras and journalists and strangers' opinions arriving faster than she could process any of it. Interviews, tours, album deals, expectations from every direction. All of it landed on her at once, and much of the coverage that followed was not especially kind. Instead of focusing on her voice, on the very thing that had made her extraordinary, parts of the press fixated instead on her appearance, her mannerisms, the small idiosyncrasies that had made people underestimate her in the first place. The same instinct that had produced those smirks in the audition room simply found new outlets, new headlines, new ways to keep underestimating her even after she'd proven them all wrong. It was during this period that Susan made a decision that reframed her entire story, one that required real courage to share publicly. She spoke openly about living with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder that had gone undiagnosed and unspoken for most of her life. The revelation cast everything that came before it in a new light. It explained the years of misunderstanding at school, the difficulty navigating social situations, the sense of being perpetually out of step with a world that never quite knew how to read her. It also explained something more immediate and more painful: why the chaos of sudden fame, the noise, the crowds, the unpredictability of a life now lived entirely in public, wasn't just difficult for her in the way it might be difficult for anyone. It was genuinely overwhelming, in ways that many people around her, caught up in the excitement of her success, did not fully grasp at the time. In the years since, Susan has spoken candidly about anxiety, about the particular exhaustion of navigating an industry built for people who crave the spotlight, when she had never once asked for it in the first place. She has described the sensory overwhelm of tour schedules and press appearances, the difficulty of maintaining any sense of routine or privacy when the entire world suddenly feels entitled to your time. Later in her life, physical health problems compounded the pressure further, including a lung infection serious enough to sideline her from work for a stretch, struggles she largely kept out of the headlines, choosing dignity and privacy over public sympathy. Around the same period, she also faced the deep, quiet grief of losing her parents, the two people whose care had shaped so much of her adult life, at a time when her professional world demanded she keep performing, keep smiling, keep showing up. Simon Cowell watched much of this unfold from a position most people never see. Not simply as the judge who had discovered her, but as someone who had witnessed up close and over the course of years what it actually costs a person to be turned into a global spectacle overnight. In interviews and public reflections given long after that night in 2009, he has returned again and again to what her story meant to him. Not merely as a career-defining television moment, though it was certainly that, but as something that permanently altered how he thought about the people who walk onto that stage in front of him. He has spoken about how her audition forced him to confront his own assumptions in real time, how it became, in his own words, one of the moments from his entire career that he thinks about the most. He has also been openly critical, in later years, of how quickly parts of the media turned on her before she'd even had the chance to sing, acknowledging that the same industry that celebrated her also, at times, failed her. That is the context behind the tears that, years later, caught the world by surprise. This wasn't a man performing sentiment for a camera, manufacturing emotion because it made good television. It was the accumulated weight of watching someone he had once, however briefly, been ready to underestimate, fight her way through prejudice, sudden fame, private struggle, and grief, and come out the other side still standing, still singing, still fundamentally herself. Susan Boyle's story never needed a fairy tale ending to matter. What it offered instead was something more honest, and in its own way, more powerful. Proof that the loudest, fastest assumptions we make about people are often the most wrong, and that resilience rarely looks like the movies promised it would. It doesn't always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a plain dress, dismissed before she'd said a word, choosing to open her mouth anyway. Sometimes it looks like choosing privacy over publicity